So, the news came out just a little while ago, back on March 21st, actually, that George Foreman, he passed away at 76 years old. And, it was one of those things where it was kind of a headline for a day and then it kind of went away. But we really thought, this is a guy, a life that deserves a much deeper look
Yeah, for sure.
because, George Foreman, you think of him and it's like boxing gloves, championship belts,
Right.
but there's just so much more to him.
Absolutely. His story is truly one of kind of a remarkable reinvention, right? You have this incredibly powerful force in the boxing ring. The two-time heavyweight champion, the Olympic gold medalist, and then sort of this unexpected massive success in the world of business.
Right.
And that's kind of what we want to explore in this deep dive is the journey, right? The key moments, the transformations that kind of made him such this compelling figure.
Yeah, exactly. So we went through and we looked at a bunch of stuff, articles, reports, you name it, to kind of try and understand all these different layers to his life. And so the goal here is not just to sort of recite the facts, but to really unpack some of those really pivotal moments and give you a much richer understanding of this man.
For sure.
So, where do we even start with a life this big?
Well, I think we got to start at the very beginning.
Okay, let's do it.
I said George Edward Foreman was born on January 10th, 1949 in Marshall, Texas.
Okay.
But his early years were actually spent in Houston, and more specifically, the Bloody Fifth Ward. It was, considered a really tough part of the city, grew up in a big family, one of 7 children, raised by his mother, Nancy Ree Nelson, and his stepfather, J.D. Foreman. It wasn't until later in life that he actually found out that his biological father was Leroy Moorhead.
So it sounds like kind of a tough beginning, right? From what we read, those early years were pretty rough. He's talked about being involved in bullying, even some petty crime, mugging, brawling. Really paints a picture of a challenging environment. One that ultimately led him to dropping out of school at just 15 years old.
Right. And you can imagine at that age, in those circumstances, kind of where do you go from there?
Total lack of direction. Yeah, it seems like it would be.
Totally. But what's fascinating is how even a seemingly small event can just totally alter the course of a life.
Right.
So at 16, Foreman sees a television ad for the Job Corps. Now, the Job Corps, part of President Johnson's Great Society initiative, he decides to enroll. And this turns out to be a truly pivotal moment for him. He gets vocational training, learns skills like carpentry and bricklaying, gives him some much-needed structure, kind of a possible career path, and he ends up stationed out in Oregon.
Wow. So this was really kind of a turning point for him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's within the Job Corps that he kind of finds this outlet for all that aggression.
Right.
Boxing becomes a way to channel all that energy.
Makes sense. So how does that happen?
Well, a counselor and coach within the Job Corps named Doc Broadus, he sees Foreman's raw power.
Okay.
And encourages him to try boxing. So it's in that structured environment that he first starts learning the fundamentals of the sport.
Okay. So he's like, what, 16, 17 years old at this point?
Yeah, around there.
Okay.
Yeah. And get this, his very first amateur fight, January 1967, it ends in a first-round knockout.
Wow.
Pretty strong start.
Yeah. That's pretty emphatic. It's a sign of things to come, right?
Oh, yeah. It is. He just progresses rapidly through the amateur ranks.
Yeah.
Winning titles like the San Francisco Examiner's Golden Gloves and the National Boxing Championships.
Wow.
And by the time he decides to turn pro, his amateur record's at 22 wins with only 4 losses.
That's pretty incredible. But the real highlight of his amateur career, the thing that I think put him on the map, had to be the 1968 Olympics, right? In Mexico City.
Oh, absolutely.
He's just 19 years old at this point, and incredibly, he'd only been boxing seriously for 20 months.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. He wins the gold medal in the heavyweight division, defeats a very skilled Soviet fighter, Jonas Yepulus.
Okay.
By technical knockout in the second round. And for Foreman, he described this as like the happiest day of his life.
Wow.
It was a monumental achievement for him.
Yeah, and there's that iconic image, right, of him after the win, waving the small American flag in the ring.
Yeah.
And I feel like it takes on even more significance when you remember, what was happening at that time.
Right.
The racial unrest in the United States, the protests by other African-American athletes at those same Olympics.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is Foreman, consistently throughout his life spoke about that Olympic gold medal. It
Sure.
wasn't just like a fleeting moment. It was an achievement that he cherished.
Right.
And if you connect it back to, his challenging upbringing, the poverty, those brushes with the law, it kind of highlights the impact of, the Job Corps Doc brought us.
Right.
And the importance of, finding a positive direction. And then that patriotic act, right, adds a layer of complexity to his early identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So from that incredible Olympic success, I mean, the next natural progression is to turn pro. And that's exactly what he did in 1969. And I mean, he started off with a third-round knockout. I mean, he didn't exactly ease his way into the pro ranks, did he?
Not at all, no.
13 fights in that first year alone, all wins.
All wins.
11 by knockout. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah, he was remarkably active in those early professional years, just really honing his skills, building up his reputation. And then 1970 continues that momentum, another 12 victories, again 11 by knockout. And he starts facing some bigger names during this period, people like Gregorio Peralta, George Juvelo, tough, experienced opponents.
Right.
And by 1972, his record was a perfect 37 wins, no losses, and 35 knockouts.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of dominance is really what propels him, right, to that #1 challenger ranking by the WBA and the WBC, the two major governing bodies, right, in professional boxing.
Absolutely. Sets the stage for the massive showdown with the undefeated and undisputed champion, Joe Frazier.
Yeah.
The Sunshine Showdown in January 1973 in Kingston, Jamaica.
Right.
Now, Frazier at this point, 29-0, he was the formidable champion. And what's, I think, really surprising is that Foreman actually went into this fight as a 3-1 underdog.
It's hard to imagine that now, though, right? I mean, given what happened.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, it just absolutely demolished him.
Oh, it was a display of just sheer power. He knocks Frazier down 6 times in just the first 2 rounds. The fight's ultimately stopped. Technical knockout in the second round. Now, for those who maybe aren't super familiar with boxing, a technical knockout means that the referee or the ringside doctor will stop the fight because one of the fighters is deemed unable to continue, even if they haven't been knocked unconscious.
Right.
And in this case, Frazier had just taken so much punishment that the fight just couldn't go on.
Yeah.
And with that victory, George Foreman became the new undisputed heavyweight champion of the world.
And of course, Howard Cosell's just iconic commentary, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier.
Yeah.
I mean, instantly recognizable.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, even people who don't follow boxing know that line.
Oh, yeah. He also claimed the Ring Magazine's heavyweight title, which is, a highly regarded recognition in the sport.
Right.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting, the media at this time, how they portrayed him, they often painted him as this kind of aloof and antisocial figure, which is really interesting when you think about the warm, engaging personality he kind of became known for later.
Right. Yeah. Quite a contrast. And Foreman himself later admitted that, this was somewhat intentional. He was trying to project a certain image,
Right.
maybe modeled after someone like Sonny Liston, trying to, really intimidate.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. So during his first reign as champion, he defended his titles twice. First round knockout of Jose Roman, and then a second round knockout of Ken Norton, who was a tough, really well-respected fighter himself. So you look back at this initial phase of his professional career, what really jumps out is just that raw, natural talent, like almost unmatched punching power. It seemed like in those early fights, force was enough to carry him to victory. But it also kind of feels like this sets the stage for some of those later developments, both in his fighting style and in his public persona, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That raw power was undeniable. As his career progressed,
Yeah.
we see a greater kind of development of his overall boxing skills, strategy. And that initial, somewhat distant persona is definitely a far cry from the more affable figure he would eventually become.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting to think about, how much of that early image was kind of constructed, like was he doing that on purpose, or is that just how he was?
I think it's an interesting question to ask. How much of a public persona early on is crafted and constructed.
Yeah. Okay, so then we get to 1974, and what is arguably the most famous fight of his career. I mean, maybe one of the most iconic boxing matches of all time. The Rumble in the Jungle against Muhammad Ali in Kinshasa, Zaire. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, this was a huge global event. And, Don King, the promoter, really played up that back to Africa aspect of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And the whole narrative leading up to that fight was so compelling. You had the seemingly unstoppable, undefeated champion, Foreman, right?
Right.
And then you had the 32-year-old Ali who, despite his, legendary status, was considered the underdog by many. I mean, Foreman was younger, on paper stronger, and Ali had experienced some losses in recent years.
And then Ali unveils this totally unexpected, I mean, frankly, incredibly risky strategy, the rope-a-dope.
Right.
So for those who might not be familiar, can you kind of break down what Ali was actually doing in the ring?
Yeah, it was Ali just completely surprised everybody. Instead of trying to, outbox this powerful Foreman, which is what everybody expected, he spends a lot of the fight leaning against the ropes, literally. He covered up his head, his body, and was essentially absorbing Foreman's punches. And the idea behind this was twofold. One, to conserve his own energy in the incredible heat of Zaire. And second, to allow Foreman to kind of punch himself out, tire himself out through the sheer volume and force of his blows.
Mm.
And the elasticity of the ropes actually helped dissipate some of that impact. And there were also many reports that Ali was talking to Foreman during the clinches.
Oh, wow.
Taunting him, trying to get under his skin and wear him down mentally.
Right.
So it was a psychological battle as much as it was a physical one.
It sounds incredibly dangerous, though. I mean, to absorb that much punishment, especially from someone like Foreman with that kind of power.
Yeah, immensely risky.
Yeah.
And it required incredible toughness, right?
Right.
And really a deep faith in his ability to withstand the punishment and that Foreman would tire. But by the 8th round, it was clear that Foreman's punches had lost a lot of their power. He was getting exhausted. And Ali, he saw his opening.
And he took it, and just with incredible speed, he unleashes this rapid combination of punches, and against all expectations, he knocks Foreman out in the 8th round. Ali reclaims the world heavyweight title in what was just a monumental upset. And I think it's interesting to note that even when the fight was stopped, Ali was ahead on all 3 judges' scorecards.
Yeah, it's a testament to how effective that strategy was, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And, for Foreman, this was his first professional loss.
Right.
And it had a huge effect on him psychologically. It made him question, his invincibility, shook his confidence. And he later admitted that, initially he just wanted to forget the whole thing.
Right.
But when you analyze it, the rope-a-dope was just a stroke of tactical genius, right?
Right.
He used Foreman's aggression, the conditions, to his advantage.
Wow.
It's really, it makes you think about the mental side of sports at that level.
Yeah.
And how an unexpected strategy can just totally change the course of a fight.
Yeah, and I think that loss, it wasn't just a setback in his career. You can almost see that it had a much deeper impact, a much more significant psychological impact. And many people believe that this really played a role in his first retirement a few years later. You almost see the seeds of that later, much more profound transformation, right, being sown after this defeat.
I think that's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Rumble in the Jungle was a turning point.
Right.
Not just for Ali, but for Foreman.
Right.
I think it led to, some real introspection and ultimately to that really dramatic spiritual awakening.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because we get to 1977, and he loses this fight to Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico,
Right.
and he decides to step away from boxing. But this isn't just like, a regular retirement, right?
Okay.
It's followed by this really pretty life-altering religious conversion.
Yeah, and what's really striking about this period is the suddenness and the intensity of this transformation. So in the dressing room, after the Young fight, he experiences what he described as, this profound born-again experience.
Yeah.
Christian conversion. He talked about how he felt like he was in a life or death struggle, and that he heard this voice saying, "I don't want your money, I want you."
Wow.
And this wasn't, a gradual thing. It was like a total overhaul of his worldview.
Yeah, that's a really powerful and very personal experience to have. And I mean, it leads to a huge change in his life and his priorities.
Oh, absolutely. Just a year later, in 1978, he's ordained as a Christian minister. And then in 1980, he founds the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ in Houston.
Okay.
And he dedicates himself, wholeheartedly to preaching, to his ministry. It's a complete 180 from the world of professional boxing.
Yeah.
His whole life focus shifts from these athletic achievements to these spiritual pursuits. And I think the intensity and the speed of this conversion, it's just remarkable.
It is.
And it really speaks to this deep internal shift.
And then almost a decade later, in 1987, he does something that just absolutely shocks the entire boxing world. He announces that he's coming back to boxing at age 38. I mean, that's pretty much unheard of.
Totally unexpected. And he states that his primary motivations were, some financial difficulties and a desire to raise money for his youth center.
Okay.
And when he returns to the ring, he's got a noticeably heavier physique. He's around 267 pounds.
Right.
And a much different, more relaxed fighting style. He still has that incredible power, but he relies a lot more on his strength and it seems like much improved stamina.
Yeah.
He famously said that turning 40 isn't a death sentence.
Right.
Signaling that he was going to defy expectations about age.
Right. So, I mean, he backs it up, right? I mean, with an incredible win streak, 24 consecutive victories, most of them by knockout, and again, against fighters who were often much younger than him. It really defied the conventional wisdom about boxing comebacks.
It really did. And this remarkable run earns him a shot at the undisputed heavyweight title against the undefeated Evander Holyfield in 1991. Now, Foreman at 42, he loses that fight. But even getting to that level after such a long layoff is a pretty incredible accomplishment.
Right. Right. But the real magic, the thing that I think really cemented this comeback as one of the greatest in sports history, came on November 5th, 1994. At the age of 45, he faces 26-year-old Michael Moore for the unified WBA, IBF, and lineal heavyweight titles. Now, for folks who might not be familiar with that term, lineal champion basically means the fighter who defeated the previous champion in like a recognized sequence of title fights. So like who's the man who beat the man?
Right, exactly.
That's the thing.
Yeah, like the true lineage, if you will.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So what happens in this fight?
Well, it was just, unbelievable. Foreman, the total underdog, he patiently stalks Moore, and then in the 10th round lands a devastating right hand, knocks Moore out. At 45, George Foreman becomes the oldest heavyweight champion in history. And that span of over 20 years between his first and second title reigns is the longest in boxing history.
Unbelievable.
It was an unprecedented achievement and a truly inspiring moment.
And his dedication of that win to all my buddies in the nursing home and all the guys in jail, I mean, so memorable.
Oh, yeah.
Really resonated with people. It really spoke to his humility, right?
Yeah.
His connection to a much broader audience.
It did, absolutely. And he relinquished the WBA and IBF titles shortly after that victory. He had one more fight in 1997, losing to Shayna Briggs at the age of 48, and then he retires for good. And his career record ends at 76 wins, 68 by knockout, and only 5 losses.
That's an incredible career.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
And when you look back at that comeback, it just speaks to, his resilience, his determination, that ability to adapt his style as he got older.
Right.
His 1994 victory was this huge cultural moment, demonstrating that age doesn't have to be a barrier to achieving great things.
Yeah.
And that dedication of that win, I think, just further endeared him to the public.
Yeah, for sure. So then we get to this chapter of his life where I think for a lot of people, this is what he became most synonymous with, which is the George Foreman Grill. It's crazy how much of a cultural phenomenon and commercial success that became.
It is truly a remarkable story of, entrepreneurial success. So the initial concept, the George Foreman lean, mean, fat-reducing grilling machine, grill designed to cook food on both sides while draining away fat.
Right.
This came from an inventor named Michael Bohm.
Yeah.
Foreman is approached to endorse the product, and it's launched in 1994. Right around the time of his comeback.
It's funny because I remember reading that, he wasn't initially sold on the idea. Like, it was his wife that really saw the potential in this.
Yeah, that's right. And her intuition was spot on.
It was.
The George Foreman grill became an absolute commercial juggernaut.
Right.
Selling over 100 million units worldwide since it was introduced. By 1998, annual revenue peaked at $200 million.
Wow.
It became this household name. And I think what's fascinating here is not just the product itself, but, Foreman's endorsement.
Yeah, I mean, Foreman himself was such a key part of that success, that kind of warm, approachable personality, those enthusiastic, and it felt like really genuine infomercials. And of course, that iconic tagline, "It's so good I put my name on it." It just felt so authentic coming from him.
He was the perfect spokesperson, right?
Yeah.
He was relatable, genuinely enthusiastic about the product. And initially, he was making a good percentage of the profits from each grill sold, which, translated to millions of dollars a month. And then in 1999, the company that manufactured the grill, Sultan, they made a decision to buy out the rights to use his name and likeness, and they paid him $138 million.
Wow.
Yeah, his total earnings from the George Foreman grill are estimated to be over $200 million, which is more than he made in his entire boxing career.
Wow.
It's amazing.
It's
It
incredible.
really highlights, how an athlete's brand can extend so far beyond just, the sport itself.
Yeah, and it really did. I mean, the grill, it went beyond just being a kitchen appliance. It was a pop culture phenomenon. It showed up in TV shows, movies. I mean, there were jokes about it. I mean, it was everywhere. And it really underscores this remarkable transition, right?
Yeah,
From this world of pro boxing to this mainstream commercial success.
absolutely. It's, I think, a fascinating case study in how an athlete can, pivot into a totally different field. He didn't just kind of fade away. He built an entirely new career,
Yeah.
and an incredibly lucrative one at that.
Yeah. So outside of his boxing career and this really surprising business success, I mean, George Foreman, he had a really rich and full personal life. He was married 5 times. And his marriage to Mary Joan Martelli lasted from 1985 until his passing.
Yeah, and together they raised a huge family,
Yeah.
12 children,
Wow.
7 daughters, 5 sons. And famously, all 5 of his sons were named George Edward Foreman,
That's right.
each with their own, distinct nickname. He's even got 2 grandsons named George. And he said he did this because he wanted to create this strong sense of family identity. And their family life actually became the subject of a reality show in 2008 called Family Foreman.
Of course it did.
Yeah.
And, throughout his later life, his faith remained such a central and guiding force. We talked about his conversion, his ministry.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He remained deeply committed to the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ in Houston, which he founded back in 1980. But maybe one of his most significant and lasting contributions was the George Foreman Youth and Community Center in Houston, which he established in 1984, funded in part by his early boxing earnings, and then later, significantly, by the profits from the grill. And, he often spoke of this as his most important achievement.
Mm.
It was his way of giving back to the community where he grew up,
Yeah.
and providing guidance and opportunities for underprivileged youth.
Yeah. He was also involved in a bunch of other, charitable things, supporting initiatives like Knock Out Pediatric Cancer. And in his own life, he had this big ranch near Marshall, Texas. And for 12 years, he served as a ringside analyst for HBO.
Right.
Bringing his own unique perspective to boxing commentary. It really paints a picture of a man with, a wide range of interests and a deep commitment to both his family and his community. That decision to name all of his sons George Edward, it really, speaks to that importance of legacy and family ties for him.
It does. It seems like he really understood, the impact of his success.
Right.
And wanted to use it to try and make, a positive change in people's lives, especially those who came from similar backgrounds to his own.
Yeah. Yeah. So we come back around to the news of his passing on March 21st, 2025 at 76. And, he lived a life that left a huge mark. I mean, there was just this massive outpouring of reactions and tributes. It really speaks to the impact he had on so many different levels. His family's social media announcement described him as their beloved George Edward Foreman Sr., who passed away peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. And they talked about his deep faith, his humility, his sense of purpose,
Right.
all of his different roles. Humanitarian, Olympic athlete, 2-time world champion, a guy they clearly saw as a force for good in the world. And, they requested privacy at the time, and the initial reports didn't give, a cause of death.
And the tributes came in from everywhere. Fellow boxing legends like Mike Tyson, they shared, these really heartfelt messages. Prominent figures in the boxing world like Louis Riddick, Mauricio Suleiman, they also expressed their admiration for Foreman's impact.
Right.
And then, of course, the sports media outlets, they all remembered him as this true legend, this icon. And they talked about not just his boxing achievements, but that remarkable success in business.
Right.
Just the fascinating arc of his career, from that really intimidating young champion to this, beloved and affable pitchman.
Yeah.
And many people said that his second act was one of the most successful and transformative in sports history.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how someone can completely redefine their public image and achieve success in things that seem so totally different.
It does.
And you look back and his initial impact on boxing is undeniable. That really dominant and honestly pretty shocking victory over Joe Frazier. And then the unprecedented comeback to win that heavyweight title again at 45. I mean, that's just unheard of.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the incredible and lasting success of the George Foreman grill. I mean, that made him, a household name for a whole new generation. But beyond the titles and the business ventures, I think ultimately he'll be remembered as this humanitarian, this Olympic hero, devout preacher, devoted husband, loving father. That George Foreman Youth and Community Center in Houston, really stands as this tangible representation of his legacy and his commitment to giving back.
It really does.
And while Down Goes Frazier will always be kind of associated with that fight. I mean, even though it was Howard Cosell who said it.
Right, right.
Foreman's own tagline for the grill, "It's so good I put my name on it." It just perfectly captured that, that later persona of his.
It did.
Yeah.
And in a really poignant Instagram post, just weeks before he passed, he shared a quote and it said, "All things are possible if we only believe."
And, when you reflect on his life, from that challenging upbringing in Houston to Olympic glory to heavyweight championships, this totally unexpected entrepreneurial success, I think that message of belief really, really resonates.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the power of belief in your own life and what's possible if you just embrace it, just as George Foreman did. And he had that remarkable ability to constantly reinvent himself and achieve success in so many different areas. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.